Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 395. Welcome to the third lecture in this course. Here, this semester, we're examining modern California history, culture within California, in the last 120 years. This is a class, California Cultures, which is dedicated to studying modern California history and the history of California in the 20th and 21st century. And so today we turn our attention to a key development within California history in the 20th century, the rise of Hollywood and how motion pictures and the motion picture industry came to California, established themselves in California, and in doing so made California the epicenter of a form of expression, a form of culture that so influences the nation and the world in the 20th century. One of the big themes in this class is how what happens in California proves to be so consequential, so influential in influencing the totality of American history. We saw that in the progressive era. In many ways, the patterns of immigration and exclusion that we saw in lecture last week are connected to the broader theme of immigration in American history in the early 20th century. Here today, that point, that theme, that argument that what happens in California has such a crucial and vital influence on the totality of U.S. and world history is made emphatically as we turn our attention to the origins and development of a cultural institution that emanates out of California in the 20th and now 21st century that has such an influence beyond the borders of California around the United States and around the world. Let's talk about the rise of Hollywood. When film first began, movies were mostly produced in New York and New Jersey. There is no one origin story of cinema. The science behind being able to capture images, project them as motion pictures, is a complicated story. Many different nations around the world are producing that technology in the late 19th century. The United States is just one of many countries that is experimenting and ultimately perfecting this technology of motion pictures. And one of the very first pioneers here in the United States in that regard was Thomas Edison. And he was based in New York. And he pioneered a number of the technologies necessary, the kinetoscope and others, for capturing motion and then projecting motion in a way that we identify as a film, as the origins of movies. And so the very first movies made in America were made by tinkerers and inventors, pioneers like Edison. They tended to be made in New York. Thomas Edison had an office building in New York, and on the roof of that office building, taking advantage of what natural light may be available at that time of year in New York, he made some of the very first silent films in American history. Because the story of cinema is in part the story of invention and technology, these devices, remarkable at the time, that allowed human beings for the first time in human history to capture and project motion, Edison invented these machines, and then he had control over them as he had obtained patents. And that meant if you wanted to make motion pictures, your ability to do so was limited because you had to have access to this technology that was provincial, that was protected, that was only available to Edison and those who secured these patents. And so this is part of the reason why cinema eventually makes its way to California. People wanted to evade patent law. They wanted to use these machines and make movies with inventions, machines that had been created by Edison and others, and the patents granted them exclusive control over those technologies. And so from the very beginning, cinema arrived in California as an outlaw effort by people seeking to evade patent law, far away from New York, far away from the state courts of New York, far away from the reach of Thomas Edison. You could make movies. You could sometimes use these kinetoscopes and other devices that Edison had created. So cinema began a sort of a renegade outlaw effort that saw people create film studios far away from New York in California, where they could evade patent law, where they could evade the reach of Edison and his lawyers. And that element of the history of cinema complements images of the West as the wild, wild West, as a place of lawlessness. And it helps us understand, therefore, why California, of all places, would become one of the centers of film production, even though film production began and enjoyed its early stage in New York City and New Jersey. William Selig was one of the very first to set up a film studio as early as 1908 here in Los Angeles. George Spohr established a film studio in Oakland because in the early 20th century, the largest city in California was not Los Angeles, it was San Francisco. San Francisco was a large city, the most populous city in California. It was considered an international city, a gateway to the Pacific. And so it made logical sense to establish a film industry there. And early in the 20th century, Spohr, establishing S&A Film, produced hundreds of films. And some of the most popular early films were Westerns. Westerns that gained a sense of authenticity and verisimilitude because they weren't made on a rooftop in New Jersey like Edison had made Westerns. They were made in the West. Some of the very first films to star Charlie Chaplin, the British comedian, were made in Oakland by Spohr. Why, though, does a film industry that was established in the Bay Area and producing hundreds of films gravitate further south to the sleepier, less populated town of Los Angeles? Well, LA offered a lot of the advantages that California offered to filmmakers: abundant sunlight, a variety of different vistas and topographies and geographies, so you can make westerns, but you could also make pirate epics and historical epics in mountain areas in Southern California. But also it was much more proximate to the Mexican border than San Francisco. And that meant if lawyers come after you with patent laws, with subpoenas, trying to get you to cease production, you could quickly take your film equipment, flee to Mexico, wait out the heat, and then come back and resume making film. So Los Angeles ultimately became favored because film production in California began as this outlaw effort that was designed to evade the law, to avoid the enforcement of patent laws, also union laws, which required you to have union labor in some instances. So the establishment of film production in Los Angeles began as an outlaw effort. But once here, they took a look around and they saw all of these attributes of Southern California, its natural attributes, its topography, its geography, and they realized this was a natural film studio, that the environment of Southern California was so suited to making films. So California from the very beginning was instrumental to the establishment of a film industry, not only because it was so far from the East Coast and therefore could allow this sort of renegade outlaw effort, not only because it was so close to a foreign country, Mexico, where American law was not applied. California was instrumental because it was part of the movies. It was sort of an actor in film from the very beginning, a character. California has been a character in film and remains so to this day. In the background, you saw California, and California therefore beamed across film screens around the country. It was one of the ways in which the world came to see California, because it was so visible in the films made amidst the topography, geography, and natural abundance and physical properties of California, which included lots of sunshine. In the early 20th century, and even today, one of the most expensive aspects of filmmaking: lighting. Later in the class, we'll talk about film noir and these movies that are made by Hollywood studios in the 40s and 50s that involve shadows and darkness, and they use it to sort of amplify the themes of the film as they represent California, in particular Los Angeles, in a dark light. And the reason why film noir was so dark was that it was very expensive to use lighting that would illuminate the scenes captured on film. And so in the B movies, the less budgeted the films made that are often considered film noir, The studio didn't allocate much of those expensive lights. They were reserved for the A pictures, and so you have that quality of film noir, which we'll talk about in a separate lecture coming soon. I know you're thrilled. You can't wait. So lighting was expensive. Lighting was the largest budget line in a film. And so if you could use natural light, sunshine, to make films, it made for films that were less expensive, that didn't require the expensive artificial electric lights. And it made for films that were sort of vibrant and leapt off the silver screen and really captured the imagination and attention of audiences who saw these films that were so bright. And so the sunshine of California plays a role in gravitating towards Los Angeles as the center of film production. As I've mentioned already, as we reiterate here, the topography of Southern California was so varied. This is something that makes life in Southern California so appealing. You can go from the beach to the mountains, the beach to the desert in an hour or two. And that meant you could stage all sorts of epic films, pirate films, films set in mountain regions, mountain men, pioneers, westerns, deserts, which made for historical epics. So it was this very topography that made Southern California so popular. One key early pioneer in Hollywood and Hollywood history and the establishment of a film industry here in Southern California, W Griffith, who first came to Los Angeles in 1910. He made the film The Thread of Destiny, and then later the film Ramona, which was based on a legend, a story from the Spanish period. And these were some of the very first films he made here in California, and they helped bring California as an image, as an ideal to people throughout the United States who saw California for the first time literally through the lens of a movie. For so many Americans and now people around the world, California exists as a movie. We have, in many ways, a mentality towards California as a movie-made landscape in the sense that we know California from film. And the first time for a wide audience to see California in this way was through the pioneering efforts of W Griffith, who came out here, made these movies. Ramona in particular sort of drew upon this romantic image of California. Based in the Spanish period, before the Mexican period, a romantic love story, Ramona. So it revealed California as well as complemented already extant romantic images of California from the Spanish period. And so Griffith sees what California, and in particular Los Angeles, Southern California, offers as a landscape for making films. And as a result, he makes more films here. He's a huge pioneer, as we'll talk about in a moment, in the history of Hollywood cinema. And others see the advantage of making films in California. In some of the films made in the silent period, the early 20th century, they use the term a Hollywood production. And that's really arguably the first time the word Hollywood refers more than just a neighborhood in Los Angeles, an area in the Hollywood Hills. It's the way in which we use Hollywood today, not as a description of a place within Los Angeles, but as the signifier, as this term that connotes film, celebrity, glitz, glamour, a Southern California image of the beautiful, the vain, all the things that today we associate with Hollywood. For the first time, Americans learned of this place in Los Angeles, this neighborhood, Hollywood, through movies. So from the very beginning, we associated Hollywood with something beyond a geographic marker of one city, one area in Los Angeles. From the very beginning, Americans associated that term with the movies and all that movies would come to connote. Can't overstate the impact of World War I on Hollywood, on the United States, and the American film industry that would soon emanate from Southern California. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, no nation owns the origin story of film. No one person or one individual or one country birthed film. Film was invented in many different countries through various different means of capturing and representing motion. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, a lot of movies are being made around the world. Film is certainly an international technology, an art form. France and Great Britain were leading nations in the film industry of this period, and a lot of French and British films were very popular here in the United States. This is the silent era, so there's no language barrier. And a lot of the films made in France and Great Britain were considered very technically advanced, arguably better than the films being made in the United States. But then World War I breaks out in 1914, and France and Germany and Great Britain, all the nations involved in that conflict, go to war. And this meant they weren't making movies. The film industries in these countries involved in World War I either closed altogether or severely receded. The actors, writers, directors, the people who could have later contributed to French cinema, German cinema, British cinema, died on the Western Front. They lost a generation of actors, writers, people who could have contributed to the further development of these industries. And yet, the world wanted movies. And so America filled the void left by this restriction of film production in Europe. So World War I was a great boon to the United States, which previously was competing with other nations. Many foreign films were popular here in the United States because it was the silent era and you didn't have a language barrier or a need for authentic accents. And so prior to World War I, the United States was not the leading producer of film. But World War I dealt a serious blow to the film industries in Europe as the war itself made its demands and ravages. And then in the aftermath of the war, the film industries in these countries would suffer in their efforts to rebound. And during that period, the United States continued to make films. The United States eventually becomes involved in World War I in 1917, but there were no battles fought here in the United States, no cities bombed. Though 100,000 American soldiers will die in World War I, it didn't lead to mass death in the millions like it does in Europe. And so we were largely insulated from the effects of World War I, and therefore the American film industry could thrive. After World War I, the United States emerged as the largest exporter of films, exporting them around the world. World War I helped make the United States what it remains today, this titan in global cinema. It made Hollywood, Los Angeles, the center of a now global film industry, as celluloid dreams produced in Hollywood, Culver City, all the areas around Los Angeles, now were exported to the world because there was a dearth, a lack of films coming out of other nations, those that had been ravaged and destroyed by World War I and those who continued to suffer the ill effects of World War I, how devastating that conflict was. By 1925, 7 years after the end of World War I, 95% of films shown in Great Britain were produced in the United States, most of them produced in Southern California, in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. So World War I had many consequences for humanity, for the United States, for California. It put California on the map as the center of film production, satisfying the desire for film, the demand for film, not just within the United States, but around the globe. In the early 20th century, in the silent era, movies were associated with working class people. They were considered working class entertainment. When films begin, they are considered outlaw efforts by rogue individuals who are often evading the law to make the films. The people who act in the films were often considered immoral because of a long-standing tradition associating theater and acting with immoral people of immoral license. And so the production of film was associated with coarse, vulgar elements of society. That's why many people who were subject to religious persecution in the United States, Jewish Americans, gravitated to Hollywood because it was considered unseemly for Protestant Americans to work within that industry. And so that's why many Jewish Americans became so prominent within acting and in Hollywood, in film production. And then the audience for film was considered coarse and vulgar, the working class. So the silent era was a time where Hollywood and film production was not the sort of mainstream, commonplace cultural form, it was largely identified with the working class. The pioneers in film were often, again, people who themselves were subject to marginalization, persecuted because of their ethnic and religious background. Hollywood and cinema early in the 20th century was not a billion-dollar industry, and so the profits were very, very slim. And the audience for these films also were considered impoverished, coarse, working-class people. As a result of that, the producers of early cinema made short movies, usually one-reel films that came in about 12 minutes. And the reason for that was, one, instrumental, that it was expensive to make movies, particularly lighting and other technological demands of film production. But another reason why movies were so short was that they were the province of the working class. They were made for working class people. And there was this idea that uneducated working class people in America in the early 20th century won't sit still for anything more than 12 minutes. They don't have the attention span. They don't have the intellectual capacity. And so that's another reason why films were short in the silent period, because it was assumed that the audience for these films, working class people, aren't intelligent enough or patient enough or sophisticated enough to sit through an epic feature-length film. But in the 1910s, and then certainly by the 1920s, experiments in feature-length film began. And with it came film as an art form, film as increasingly sophisticated, and with that, the mainstreaming of Hollywood and cinema. What had once been the province of the working class, now consumed by a larger audience who saw films as more sophisticated, glamorous, with the way in which, in the 1920s in particular, Hollywood studios marketed films based on stars, with the emergence of Charlie Chaplin, but Mary Pickford more so, as people who could sell tickets. When cinema first began, the emphasis was on plot and theme. But by the 1920s, what is being emphasized in advertising marketing isn't what the film's about, but who's in it. And you have the advent of a star system that will create celebrities in a 1920s America that really marks the beginning of a celebrity culture, where someone like Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, as well as Babe Ruth and Charles Lindbergh would be household names known to Americans east and west, north and south. A great deal of the celebrity culture in the 1920s came from the fact that Americans across a now broader swath of the population and across a larger geographic expanse are all watching the same movies. And so they learn the name Charlie Chaplin or Mary Pickford. So what's happening is that by the 1920s, with the United States and California, therefore, as the center of film production, emerging as this great influencer of global dreams from the dream factories of Los Angeles, films are becoming more sophisticated. They're becoming more glamorous in the way in which a star system is created that emphasizes these beautiful people who are on the screen. And as a result, films become longer, more sophisticated, and they go mainstream. Griffith was key in that. He is a pioneer in the feature-length film. He made here in California Deliverance, and then in 1915 he produced what would go on to be one of the most successful films of the 20th century, The Birth of a Nation, which was first released in 1915 and was an early example of trying to break free from the niche audience of film that tended to, in the silent era, cater to the working class, and break free from the limits of the one reel 12-minute film by making an epic masterpiece, Birth of a Nation, which is a film that goes on for hours. It's, I think, a 3-hour film. It's a historical epic documenting the Reconstruction period, the period here in the United States after the Civil War. Birth of a Nation is widely cited today as one of the most racist films ever produced because it represents Reconstruction in a way in which white Southerners are the victims, where they have to accept blacks as equals. There are all these scenes of African American men lusting after white women. There are scenes of black men elected to state houses who sit in the state house of Georgia and take their shoes off and drink whiskey on the floor. It's a film where the good guys, the heroes of the film, are the Ku Klux Klan. When at the end of the film, the Klan arrive and restore the right or white order to the South, reestablishing white supremacy and white hierarchy. So this film, by every measure, is a racist document of the early 20th century that represents the Reconstruction period as one in which white Southerners were victimized by having to accept blacks as equals, and instead ends the film with this heroic reinscription of white supremacy. It's the first film ever screened at the White House, 1915. Woodrow Wilson, then president, watched this film. He himself a Southerner and racist, one of the greatest racists we ever had as president, and that's saying something in a nation where so many of our early presidents were slaveholders. Perhaps there's been no greater racist in our history than Woodrow Wilson, and he screened this film at the White House and loved every minute of it. So, Birth of a Nation, a racist film, a very problematic film, a film that's synonymous with the white supremacy and racial violence of the early 20th century. But in terms of Hollywood history, if we can separate Birth of a Nation, its content, its racist content, and just think about what it meant for California and Hollywood history, it is a film that really showed what Hollywood could do on an epic scale, making a sophisticated, complicated film with a cast of hundreds, if not 1,000, and an unqualified success that took this form of entertainment that had previously catered to working class people and brought it to the masses. By 1930, this film that had been produced in 1915, a silent film. By 1930, there are talkies, there are films with sound. And yet, by 1930, more than 100 million tickets of this film made in 1915 had been sold. And it continued to be successful as it was re-released, often at times of ascendancy and assertiveness by African Americans, because it was such a rebuke to the civil rights cause of the 20th century. So again, it's tough to liberate The Birth of a Nation from its place within white supremacy, racialized violence, our misunderstanding of the Civil War and Reconstruction period. But if we could isolate its themes and content, we could see it as a landmark effort that offered a different way of thinking about film as an epic form of storytelling, helping to vault it beyond its working class origins. So in the 1920s, movies are now part of mainstream American life. They are feature-length films starring the celebrities of this age. They are produced in a more elaborate, sophisticated way with greater budgets. And so what had begun in the silent era in the first 2 decades of the 20th century as working class entertainment was now increasingly the dominant form of entertainment in the United States, all of it increasingly emanating from Southern California, because, as we'll talk about in a moment, also in the 1920s, you have this consolidation of film, so that by the end of that decade, with the solidification of cinema in American life, there are just a handful of companies making films, all of which are based here in Southern California. Another factor that helped to establish movies as mainstream, respectable fare, even glamorous and glitzy elements of American life, in the 1920s, movie palaces are built around the country. These film theaters that are ornate, that can accommodate audiences in the hundreds, because it was a now mass audience experience, that featured vaulted ceilings, stained glass. Going to the movies in the 1920s was a source of visual delight, not just in the images flickering across the screen, but in the theater itself, because wherever you looked, there were these statues and ornate woodworkings. The movie palace in the 1920s. Today, when you go to the movies, if you do, because everyone wants to stay home and Netflix and chill, But if you do actually venture out of your house and perhaps engage with the larger public, something that is so anathema to Americans in the 21st century, as we like to stay home and Netflix and chill and DoorDash and avoid any other human beings. But if you do go to see a movie today in a multiplex, you walk into the room and there's, a few seats and the floor is sticky and the environment is anything but welcoming. It's like you're walking into an interrogation room. It looks like, say, I don't know, a lecture hall at Cal State Fullerton. But if you're going to the movies 1920s, you are walking into a movie palace, so ornate and inviting, and this complemented the idea that going to the movies was special. Going to the movies was this beautiful, glamorous experience even before the images flickered across the screen. Films 1920s are now feature films. By the end of the decade, they do feature sound. They are increasingly centered on urban areas and tell the story of a modern urban experience. They often experimented with different expressions of sexuality, of gender. In the 1920s America, where the flapper ideal of women as modern, liberated, in charge of their libidos, was part of the culture of America in the 1920s. So the movies had that appeal. They were sexy. They were modern. They were part of the jazz age Art Deco sensibilities of a 1920s America that looked to the city, even though they were still made in a Los Angeles of the 1920s that was rural and underdeveloped. If you look at a lot of the movies made on Hollywood lots in the 1920s that in the story are set in Chicago or New York, but are of course made here in Los Angeles, they really struggle to sell that idea that it's made in or set in Chicago, because you look in the background, you see cows, you see farms. So this was a sort of the counter to the advantages that Los Angeles had as a place that offered a lot of vistas and geography and topography that was suited to making westerns. When they had to make urban dramas, they sometimes struggled because Los Angeles was so underdeveloped. But Los Angeles was the center now of film production. And you get in the 1920s a consolidation of film, so that by the end of the 1920s, there are just 5 studios making movies. When cinema began in the late 19th, early 20th century, there were literally hundreds of small upstart companies making movies. By the 1920s, movies had now become big business. Consolidation. So that just 5 companies, all of which are based here in California, were no longer making movies on rooftops in New Jersey. All California-based. These 5 companies listed here on the slide, Lowe's, Warner Brothers, Paramount, RKO, 20th Century Fox, many of which are still here making movies today, were in charge of film production in totality. Just 5 companies controlled this industry. 1927, Jazz Singer is released, the first film with sound, even though only a part of that film featured sound. Most of the Jazz Singer was still a silent film with title cards, but there's a brief part of the film that features sound, with Al Jolson, the protagonist of that. The actor starred in that film singing for the audience, and he says, "You ain't heard nothing yet." Those are the first words used in American cinema in the now sound era. And this lent novelty and newness to cinema. It offered a whole new range of possibilities, because you ain't heard nothing yet. There's a lot more to come. And so industry style of film that had become a little bit staid, locked seemingly in a silent era, now vaulted into a new era. And that helped rebound interest in film. It brought audiences to film and movie palaces. It furthered the power and impact of Hollywood, as all these sound films would now be made here in Los Angeles. And it would be the first of a number of efforts that Hollywood studios would engage in to win over audiences that sometimes could be drawn away As we'll talk about at the end of this lecture, by the 1950s, most Americans have visual entertainment right there in their house. It's the television age. And that meant you didn't have to go outside your door for visual entertainment. You could turn on the TV. And so in the 50s and 60s, Hollywood now has to compete with TV. And so they innovate. Color film, 3D, big, large-scale epics that don't fit on the small black and white TV screens of the 50s and 60s got people out of their homes and into movie theaters. And then today, there's this effort to, have couches and, waiter service in theaters so that they can convince you to get out of your home. You got to be the first to see the film, and so Hollywood still prevents the simultaneous release of its most profitable films on TV, first releasing them in theaters. The blockbusters of the 70s and 80s lured people away from television. So there's been a lot of strategies, many of them technological, that the jazz singer in 1927, the talkie, the sound film, helped to really anticipate, because Hollywood is a cultural institution emanating from California of great influence, but there's many others, including television. Television also will begin as an East Coast industry, as the first television studios are in New York, but by the 50s and 60s, they're all in Burbank. They're all in Hollywood as well. And so there are other cultural institutions of influence, most of them emanating from California, television, music, that compete with Hollywood. And Hollywood had to be very skillful at finding ways to convince people to return to cinema, making cinema still such a great influence, even in a 21st century of boundless choices. The effort to create film with sound, the talkie, in 1927 was a way of bringing people back to movies. Here are a couple of images locally of what I mentioned earlier about movie palaces. On the left, a theater that's still known as Mann's Chinese, even though that's not the official name of the theater, but people understand it as such. The Chinese theater that still stands, still in operation in Hollywood to this day, was built in the late 1920s. And it's this very ornate movie palace. Of course, that theater is famous for the images of hands and feet in cement outside that draw tourists to this day. Right now, as you're listening to this lecture, there are likely tourists in their fanny packs, right there in front of the Chinese theater, putting their feet in the same indentations laid by, Arnold Schwarzenegger or The Rock or whoever is featured now. So part of what makes the Chinese theater so famous is that it has these cement, indentations, hands, and the such from various film luminaries throughout the 20th and 21st century. But if you go into the theater, get beyond the vacationers in their fanny packs out front posing with people in Batman costumes, you see this remarkable theater, huge theater, vaulted ceilings, ornate, oriental as the term is, themes, these images of kind of a faux Chinese culture and architecture. That's what movie-going was like for many Americans in the 1920s. On the right, the Egyptian theater, also still here, still in operation in Hollywood. The Egyptian theater is run by the American Cinematheque today, and they feature a lot of revival films. If you're interested in classic movies, if you're interested in some of the great films of Hollywood history later in the class, as I said, we'll talk about film noir. And if you're ever interested in seeing some of the films we'll talk about in that lecture, every year at the Egyptian Theater, the American Cinematheque has a film noir festival, and they screen some of the great classic film noir films. So the Egyptian Theater, which was created in the late 1920s, in this period we're talking about, it was inspired by the Egyptian revival that created quite a sensation in the United States. After, in the 1920s, Howard Carter finds King Tut's tomb and unearths this tomb that had been untouched for thousands and thousands of years. And so when Carter finds King Tut, the tomb of that very brief and inconsequential pharaoh, it creates this great sensation for ancient Egypt. all around the world. Here in Southern California, led to the Egyptian revival. People built homes that sort of mimicked what they imagined Egyptian architecture looked like. And in the late 20s, during that Egyptian revival and that mania about all things King Tut, the Egyptian theater was created, and it still stands. So there's a couple local landmarks, certainly institutions here in Southern California that still draw so many tourists, icons of Southern California life that still stand. So if you're interested in what it was like to go to the movies in the 1920s, if you want to get away from that miserable multiplex experience that we have today, go and see a film at the Chinese theater or the Egyptian theater, and you'll get a sense of what these movie passes were like. That's the 1920s. That's the Roaring 20s. That's the decade of a booming, roaring economy as America thrived in the aftermath of World War I. And one of the industries that certainly thrived, one of the thriving industries here in Southern California, along with oil, aviation, Hollywood. But at the end of the 1920s, that booming, roaring economy came to an abrupt halt. In 1929, the stock market crashes, and America descends into the greatest economic disaster in our history, the Great Depression. And you would expect that during a time of widespread unemployment, where people are losing their jobs, losing their homes, that they would stop going to see movies. Quite the contrary. In the 1930s, cinema got even more popular. It remained extremely popular despite the fact that people were facing this existential threat of the Great Depression and suffering from malnutrition, unemployment, living in vacant lots in shanty towns. Despite that, people still found a nickel, a dime to attend movies. 60 to 70 million Americans go to the movies at least once a week in the 1930s. It offered affordable entertainment, escape from the ravages and deprivations of the Great Depression that awaited you outside those movie palaces. And so people continued to go see movies because it offered them escape, amusement during a time of great misery, hope, and inspiration, as so many of the films in the 1930s celebrated this vision of Americana, American institutions, the American will and spirit that remains indomitable despite the ravages and deprivations of the Great Depression. So it was very stultifying, very bracing. And so cinema, now again exclusively produced by just a few companies, all of whom are located in California, really became the common experience of the Great Depression. You'd be hard-pressed to imagine any other experience in the 1930s shared by 60 to 70 million Americans. Next week in lecture, we'll talk about the novels of John Steinbeck, the California writer based in Monterey, who in many ways is responsible for defining the Great Depression in ways we still recognize today. Those novels, Cannery Row, Grapes of Wrath, and others, remain touchstones for us as we try to understand this period in American history. But far more Americans go to see Hollywood movies in the 1930s than read Steinbeck's novels, despite their best-selling status and eventual adaptation into film. So, movies, more than novels, more than any other cultural expression in America, provided a common experience in the 1930s, a common vocabulary for Americans, a common body of images. So, the cementing of a film industry here in Southern California in the 1920s, the consolidation of film production that is now, again, exclusively in the hands of just 5 companies, meant that in the 1930s, what was being made here in California, these images really provided the most common unifying experience for all Americans. It's a good example of how what's being made in backlots in Southern California come to define the national experience. It's a good example of, again, one of the overarching themes in this class, that California in so many ways influences the whole of the nation. But in the 1930s, there's a lot of concern about morality in America. Many people took the lesson from the Great Depression that we had lost our way, that in the 1920s we became too venal, too immoral in an age that celebrated license, in an age where women were cutting their hair short, dancing the Lindy Hop, dancing and drinking in public in open violation of the law of prohibition. Many people believed that we had become greed-obsessed, celebrity-obsessed. And so cinema in the 1930s, particularly because of its outlaw origins, because it was largely dominated by people who were often marginalized as they were seen as suspect, immoral, un-American, now became the target of moral scrutiny. There was the sense that because Hollywood has such a great influence, it could urge us towards false values that a lot of Americans in the 1930s blamed for the Great Depression, arguing that the reason why we stare into the abyss, the reason why we are at the brink of self-destruction, is that we lost our way, became too enamored by greed, materialism, venality, immorality in the 1920s. Complementing this was a series of scandals that rocked the industry, that seemed to associate the movie stars of this era with license and immorality. Fatty Arbuckle was a very popular comedian in early Hollywood cinema, and he was accused of rape, though he was not guilty of that crime. It was another way of associating Hollywood film stars with immorality. And the Fatty Arbuckle trial was just one of many examples where movie stars were now associated with, again, immorality that many blamed for the crisis of the Great Depression. So from this comes efforts to regulate Hollywood, recognizing its power, recognizing its influence, recognizing in many ways that these 5 companies in Los Angeles, some of them are headed by Jewish Americans, have such influence. The National Legion of Decency forms in 1933, the Catholic League, and other moral do-gooder types want to regulate Hollywood, and in doing so, make a better America. One of the things that's fascinating about this campaign that leads eventually to a form of self-regulation is that when the Legion of Decency, the Catholic League, and others lobbied for censoring Hollywood films or regulating them in such a way, what they were acknowledging was the power of film, that this institution has great influence, that in many ways the celluloid dreams flickering across the screen coming out of California ultimately shaped the sensibilities of the nation, that we were indeed a movie-made America, meaning we came to understand who we are, our identity, our values, by watching movies. And so the Legion of Decency forms, the Catholic League lobbies politicians. We got to do something about Hollywood. We got to regulate Hollywood. Acknowledging the power of cinema, but hoping to harness that power to make a better America. If we make more moral movies, we'll make a more moral America. That we could become a movie-made nation that's more moral, cleaner in our values, more patriotic, if we made films that were subject to the influence of a moral code. So you have a critical period in Hollywood history where films that had been previously unregulated would soon be subject to regulation. But in doing so, in regulating Hollywood, there was this acknowledgement of its power to shape sensibilities. When films come under regulation, they tend to represent American life in a way that reaffirms institutions, marriage, good government, patriotism. A lot of the films that are produced by the late 30s, once production code regulations are put into place, are great odes to this idea that all is right in America. And many Americans wanted to believe that amidst the ravages and deprivations of the Great Depression. It's the point I made earlier about the value and appeal of films. They urge you to be hopeful in a time of despair. And that's why so many movies, not just in the 30s, but into the 40s and 50s, tended to reflect this idea that all is right in America. And what that means is that the movies made before regulation and then after that reflected this moral cleansing and this effort to celebrate all things America provide a real good barometer, good measure for the mood and temper of this nation. So at this point in the lecture, at this point in our story, we're not just talking about an industry. We're not just talking about a field of cultural production dominated by a few corporations set in Southern California. We're talking about how these movies made in California are historical documents, windows into an era. They not only shape the sensibilities of the nation at the time, they stand for us now as historians as windows into that time, because we were a movie-made America. What eventually becomes the answer here, what I alluded to in the previous slide, the Haze Production Code is adopted as the answer to these calls for a more regulated Hollywood. The Haze Production Code was an agreement among the 5 studios to adhere to a certain set of principles, rules, strictures, and regulations so that they would self-regulate. The U.S. government didn't want to regulate Hollywood, although they were under a great deal of pressure to do so, and there were many politicians who did believe we had to regulate Hollywood. But of course that would raise issues of free expression and First Amendment protection. So what happens instead is the studios say, we'll regulate ourselves. We're going to adopt a code, and we'll all adhere to it. And what that will mean is that the movies we make will be subject to these regulations and strictures, and ultimately, therefore, more moral. And so the Haze Production Code was adopted. It went into force in 1934 during the thickets and throes of the early Great Depression period, and it would last until the late 1960s. The Haze Production Code declared what you could and could not show in Hollywood films for decades. That's why so many films of the 40s and 50s, to our eyes, seem so saccharine, so dripping with sentiment that seems sort of corny, old-fashioned, outmoded. It's because you had to make films in that vein in order to get them approved by the code and therefore approved for release in theaters around the country. The Haze Production Code told you what you could and could not include. So, rather than direct government censorship, Hollywood polices itself. The Haze Production Code was this voluntary agreement among the studios where they agreed to make movies in line with the code. It required that films be screened and then ultimately approved by the code, and most movie theaters in the country would not show a film that wasn't bearing this seal of approval. So it really limited what could and could not be shown. It centered on 3 general principles. No film could lower the moral standards of an audience. We're going to make more moral films, and in doing so, make a more moral America, really recognizing again the power of cinema. The power of cinema to influence. We are a movie-made America. These movies emanating out of California have such influence. Only, quote, correct standards of life can be shown, meaning that you need to show people living good moral lives. This meant that if you had a film that showed a couple, a man and woman in bed together, they had to be married in the story, because the only way in which a man and woman should be in bed together is if they are married in the bonds of marriage. Another one of the general principles was law could not be ridiculed or defeated. You had to have films where the bad guy's always caught, crime doesn't pay. Later in the class, we'll talk about film noir, and as engrossing as those films are in the way in which they represent the gangster, the jewel thief, the bad guy as this really interesting and evocative character, at the end of every one of those movies, the bad guy's caught. So the most interesting character, and the bad guys are always far more interesting than the uptight, square, good guys. In every one of those films, the bad guy's always caught. And if you watch those films today, you're a little crestfallen because I like the bad guy a lot more. He's more interesting, and you kind of wish he can get away with the crime. Well, in the 40s and 50s, when those films are made, you could not show anyone getting away with a crime. In the end, the bad guy always had to be caught. To make a film that would receive the sanction of the code, you had to have this idea that crime doesn't pay. So crime doesn't pay. Institutions of authority deserve respect. Law and order cannot be ridiculed or defeated. That, along with this call for more moral films and correct standards of life, key principles that overall were to be the center of all film production coming out of Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the late 60s. Here's an image put together by a film historian of 10 things you could not show in an American movie during the era of the Haze Production Code. It's a little play on the 10 Commandments, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, thou shalt not. So the image that you see here is not from a Hollywood movie, because you couldn't show one of these, let alone 10 of them. It's one image that demonstrates some of the very specific strictures and rules in the Hays Production Code. As you can see, the first of the "thou shall not," you cannot show the law defeated. And of course, in this image, the cop is slain, shot down, bleeding. So you couldn't show that in a Hollywood film. Again, the bad guy's always caught, law and order prevails, crime doesn't pay. Instead, work hard in an America where hard work pays rather than crime. Number 2, can't show the inside of a thigh. Yes, that's far too much skin for audiences in the 40s and 50s. Such a display of skin was verboten in Hollywood movies of this period. There were strictures that applied to very specific things, like underwear. There were Hollywood studios where the sort of underwear that an actor may wear in a scene was subject to scrutiny. And one of the things you could not show was lace lingerie. You couldn't show a dead body, the fourth of the "thou shall nots" listed here. If someone died in the story, it had to be off camera. You might hear a thud of a body hitting the ground, but you couldn't show a dead body because that was considered too immoral. On the desk in the scene, heroin, couldn't show narcotics. One of the very few films to be released outside the code was Otto Preminger's The Man with the Golden Arm, released in the 1950s, starring Frank Sinatra, the singer. It was a study of heroin addiction. And Preminger is an interesting figure in Hollywood history, a provocateur, a guy who tried to break down the code. He made a number of films that dealt with taboo topics. And one such film he made was The Man with Golden Arm. And it received a very limited release, even though it starred Frank Sinatra, because it was not approved by the code and very few theaters would show it. So a lot of Americans never saw this movie because it dealt in a very frank and honest way, pardon the pun, frank way with heroin addiction, The Man with the Golden Arm, because you couldn't show narcotics, someone addicted to heroin in Hollywood movies, even in the 1950s when Preminger made that movie. You couldn't show drinking. Characters could hold a glass of liquor, but you couldn't actually see them drinking it. Again, that was off screen. An exposed bosom. Yes, the image of a woman here is showing far too much skin, whether it's her thigh or her bosom. Gambling, number 8 there on that list, also verboten because it was associated with immorality, license, all the things that brought America to destruction amidst the Great Depression. You couldn't show someone pointing a gun, as the femme fatale character, this woman is pointing the gun at the slain police officer. And a specific gun, the Tommy gun, number 10 here, so associated with the gangsters of the 20s, Al Capone and others, also banned to preserve the morality of America. So one of the things that served to bolster the Hollywood film industry was the adoption of the Hays Production Code that now assured audiences that the films they were watching were moral, that these films being produced by just a few studios in Hollywood were making for a more moral America. And so those early efforts by the Legion of Decency, the Catholic League, and others to regulate, censor, limit Hollywood ultimately failed because Hollywood said, well, we'll bend to your demands and make movies that will be warmly received by the moral police of America. And so by the 1940s, Hollywood is entrenched. Hollywood is a mainstay of American life. Hollywood is mainstream entertainment. Hollywood is the great influencer of sensibilities around the nation. It is a common experience enjoyed by tens of millions of people each and every week. It is not just this rogue outlaw industry on the fringes of American society. It is American society in a nation where we directly acknowledge that we are movie made, that we can make America through film. That's what undergirded the whole Hays Production Code effort. Make better movies, make a better America. By this time, Hollywood is more than just a neighborhood in Los Angeles. It's a synonym as it stands today, not just for an industry, but for glitz, glamour, the good life, a Southern California lifestyle centered on the beautiful, the vain, the wealthy. Today, when we use the term Hollywood, we are not describing geography. We're describing set of images and values. Movies thrived in the 1930s thanks to the Haze production code that rebuffed calls to regulate and limit Hollywood. By 1941, towards the end of the Great Depression and at the very beginnings of World War II, there are more movie theaters in America than banks. So banking collapsed amidst the Great Depression. Movies thrived with all their ability to influence. The all-time attendance peak, 1945. So after the crisis of the Great Depression came a second crisis, World War II. And Americans found solace, found release, found meaning and direction during World War II, as they had during the Great Depression, from what now stood as the great producer promulgator of meaning in American life: movies, Hollywood films. What was being produced in backlots in Southern California coming to now influence the nation. Really the big theme here of this lecture, the rise of Hollywood, how an industry that began as an outlaw effort in Southern California by the mid-20th century is defining the totality of America. The way in which Southern California, like we talk about throughout this class, comes to influence the whole of American culture, the whole of American history. As I mentioned earlier in the class, though, the ascendance of movies would soon be rivaled by another form of visual entertainment, TV. Television is the fastest technological adoption in American history. Quicker than the automobile, quicker than the radio, quicker than the internet or computers today. In the early 50s, few Americans had a TV in their home. By 1959, television is in 90% of American homes, the fastest technological adoption in American history. And now you had visual entertainment in the home. Now you don't have to leave your suburban wonderland. And so television would come to rival Hollywood. And that would set in motion efforts by Hollywood to one-up television with color films and epic films that demanded to be seen on the big screen. 3D and other gimmicks that couldn't be enjoyed in one's home. In the 60s and 70s, Hollywood abandons the production code and now makes films that feature nudity, violence, frank, sophisticated films like Taxi Driver, Godfather, that again weren't available on your TV screen. By the late 70s, 80s, you had E.T. and Jaws and Star Wars, blockbusters that you had to see immediately to be part of a culture that was so focused on now the blockbuster epic. So Hollywood's very creative, very adroit, very skilled at getting people to continue to go see movies even after television. But television now is a rival, but that rival, television, is also an industry that comes out of Southern California. Television may have begun as well as an industry emanating from New York, but by the late 50s and early 60s, television is being made in Burbank. It's being made in Television City in Los Angeles from the CBS studios, and it remains to this day. So though the story of television is a story of a rival to Hollywood, one that Hollywood successfully and then sometimes unsuccessfully, like today, tries to rival, television, though this rival, is yet another industry emanating from Southern California. Another example of how what comes out of Southern California has such great influence in American life.